Hello again, and live from my living room. It's History 1378. Welcome back. This is our third lecture. Looks like everybody's doing well. We're seeing a lot of people have viewed the previous two, so that's good. And the TAs haven't reported anything out of the normal. So I think that we're up and running fairly well. Still getting used to doing this via Zoom, recording it rather than live, where you can actually talk to people. But I think it's going well. So just to kind of a couple reminders here. If you're new, this is the syllabus. Pretty much what you need to know is on there. It's an online class. I'm doing these videos. You watch them, and we'll let you know what you need to know. Usually via Blackboard, but sometimes I'll send out emails on PeopleSoft as well. The syllabus is important to reinforce that. We have a guest here to tell
A message from Big Snoop Deal Double G to all the university students. Yo, syllabus. You gotta do it. You gotta read it. Man, I'm telling you, the more you know, the further you go. Tell them Snoop Dogg sent you. Syllabus. I know all about it. Catch up so we can have a conversation. Don't be late. Let's go.
Okay, straight from the dog pound. So remember, read the syllabus, all right? Otherwise, the reading assignments and everything else are on there, and I'm sure you're familiar with it already. So let's get to history again, picking up where we left off. Last time, one of the key themes, the key theme is how America changed, the transformation of America after the Civil War. And we've talked a lot about that. First of all, we talked about the kind of inability, the failure to address racial inequality with ex-slaves, and we're still seeing the impact of that today. Western expansion, the genocide of Indians. But the biggest theme that we kind of got to in the second class was the emergence of capitalism as this new industrial capitalist economy, emerges all over the United States, especially in the North, but also, becomes a national economic system. And how not everybody was happy about that. This new capitalism created immense wealth. And again, you're going to hear me say this all the time. Make sure you read the book carefully, all the books carefully. Created immense wealth for people like Rockefeller and Carnegie, who are discussed in some detail in the book. But for a lot of people, it created a much worse off life. People who were artisans, say, the examples I've given you before, people who had a skill, craft, shoemakers or furniture makers or whatever, often lost that because factories came in and replaced them. Factories could produce huge numbers of products, a huge number of goods, and at a much cheaper price than somebody who was making it by himself, like a shoemaker. So you had a significant number of people who were not happy, who were displaced by this new economy, and that led people to protest against it, and led Mark Twain, for instance, to call it the Gilded Age. And again, gild is like a surface covering that you put over something to make it look nice, but underneath it, it's still kind of rotten. And so Twain's point was that the coverage in the newspapers and in culture of people like Carnegie and Rockefeller was great, and it gave everybody this sense of wealth and opportunity, but the reality for most people was very different. They weren't living that way, right? And in modern times, this would be what people would say about, like, say, the 1% versus the 99%. And people have actually, in the last several years, been using that phrase, Gilded Age, once again, right? And so because of that, you have the emergence then of these oppositional movements and in fact, in some cases, even class violence. And we talked a little bit about that. And all of that stuff is in the book. I kind of went over it fairly quickly the other day. This period when I just mentioned these kind of four major actions, the Great Uprising of 1877, Haymarket, Homestead. I've added this video since then, just to give you kind of some sense, a little bit more detail of what was going on, and then Pullman. Now, in all these cases, we're kind of similar in the sense that workers rose up. Workers were really unhappy with their lives. They weren't content with the changes that capitalism had brought. There was no job security. People working for really low wages, 10, 12-hour work days, 6 days a week, sometimes maybe, and wages are different based on, kind of things like race and gender. So white men got paid more, maybe $2 a day. and women got paid less, blacks got paid less, and a significant number of children worked too, and they were paid the lowest amount of all. So you had 8-10-year-old kids, working in cotton mills and tobacco farms and coal mining and things like that. Really incredible stuff. Workers often rose up and often did it violently, but in all of these cases, and they saw themselves as part of a similar class, and that's what's important here, I think. There's a class awareness or a class consciousness, and if this was live, we'd be talking, I'd have a discussion or try to get some people to weigh in on what class is, because it's a concept that actually we, I think, do talk about now a lot more, but not as much as you would in a lot of places if you've traveled, in other places, like Europe or wherever, really, Latin America, doesn't matter. People are far more aware of the conditions of class probably than in the US. And so these workers saw themselves as part of a working class. They believed that they had something in common. They were producers. I mentioned that the other day. They made stuff. They made goods. They grew food. So they were the ones who were producing the stuff that everybody else needed to stay alive, right? So they saw themselves in relation to the people who weren't producers, the bosses, the owners, the ruling class, the oligarchs, the aristocrats, whatever you want to call them. These people in the mid-1800s used all those phrases to describe the folks who owned the means of production, who owned the factories, who owned the banks, who big farms, things like that. So they would often rise up against them. It would become violent. But in all of these cases, the outcome was pretty much always going to be the same. The bosses, the people who owned Homestead, people like Carnegie and Frick, the people who owned the McCormick, Cyrus McCormick, the McCormick Reaper Works, which means farm equipment, Pullman, the Pullman Motor Company, all had power and political influence and money and connections. So they could, refuse to give workers higher wages. And one thing that was common in a lot of these was that because of the economic conditions after the Civil War, you had a lot of depressions. I call them panics at the time. An economic panic was, if you ever see that phrase, it's basically just a depression. So in all of these cases, then you would have these panics, and bosses would lower wages, but living expenses never changed. So you might lower wages, and in a lot of these places like Pullman and a lot of coal mining towns, they were company towns. So you lived in the town that was owned by the people who also owned the business. So they would lower wages, but not lower the price of rent or lower the price in the stores where you bought things. Later on, we'll briefly talk about a major coal mining strike in the after World War I, and there's a lot about this in the book. The Battle of Blair Mountain, and that was very similar there. Workers lived in the towns that were owned by the coal mine operators who lowered wages, but didn't lower rents and didn't lower the price at the local stores, and they paid you in their company's script, their money, so you couldn't go outside and purchase stuff for a better price or anything like that. So they had the ability to do that. They could go to courts and get people, the courts would say you have to go back to work, you're not allowed to go on strike. And then they often had the state on their side. They could use coercive state power. So remember, these are private businesses, and this is really important. So these private businesses could go to the state, which is a public institution, and they could get the state to send out the police or the militias or the National Guard, or even in some cases the army, to intervene in a private dispute between bosses and workers. And the state would take the side of the bosses. So the state is not some kind of neutral, passive observer. And we said that in the first class. Remember, with capitalism, the state is deeply involved in capitalism. This is one of the ways, probably more than any other way, that it gets involved. It intervenes on behalf of private economic interest against people who work. So it's never an equal fight between labor and management, or labor and capital, however you want to phrase it, the bosses and the workers. It's never, even because the bosses have the power of the state on their side, and they could even use coercive violence, like the police or the militias or the National Guard or whatever, right? So that's the situation then mostly in factories, in urban America, in industrial America. Now, like I said the other day as we were leaving, the same thing's happening on farms. And so there are also agrarian uprisings. And a lot of this is because farmers who used to be family farmers, subsistence farmers, generally they were smaller, and they still remain that way, would grow enough stuff would raise enough crops and maybe some livestock to take care of their families, right? However, after the Civil War, farming became more capitalist, became more industrialized, became more commercialized. After the Civil War, first of all, there's a lot of new technology. So, cotton gins and new farm equipment by like John Deere and McCormick, reapers and things like that. So you can grow so much more stuff. So this leads to the emergence of industrial farming or commercial farming. So now, instead of just growing enough for your family and having a diversity of crops, big farmers on big farms tend to specialize. So big crops, and this was happening before the Civil War as well in the South, things like tobacco and cotton, wheat are more profitable. So a lot of these small farmers lose their land. Banks call in loans. Most farmers don't actually own their own land. So with the economic calamities, banks would call in loans, or big farmers would come in and buy out a bunch of small farmers. Because of the economic depressions, a lot of these farmers weren't making it, so they would have to sell. They would have to sell for whatever they could get, usually not even, a decent market price. So you have this big shift away then from family farming to commercial farming, right? Now with this, and I think this is the last thing I said the other day, they also kind of lost their producer's image, right? They believed, especially even more than industrial workers, they believed that they were producers. They saw themselves as the people growing food. Remember up here in this pyramid, we feed all. So they believed they were doing the most important thing in society, enabling other people to survive, to live, because they grew the crops that you needed and they raised the livestock that you needed, right? So you have this massive shift in the way farming is conducted. You have the emergence of these much more massive farms all over the country. A lot of people who used to be farmers now have to become workers. They have to work for a wage. No longer can they have their own life. They no longer have their independence. And that producer's image also involves that, being independent, not relying on others. You can take care of your own. You can, raise crops, and you can produce stuff for other people, and you can take care of your own family and enable them to live well also. And now that's gone. So you have a massive loss of land all over places like Kansas, Nebraska, Indiana, kind of that middle western area there, Iowa, places where today there's still a lot of farming being done. And there are a lot of people who wrote about this at the time. There are a lot of farmers who were upset about it. There was a famous farm agitator named Kate Richards O'Hare, who grew up in Kansas and remembered, she later wrote kind of a memoir about how her family had lost its land, lost their home, lost their way of life. They had to become wage workers. They lived in rural Kansas and they had to move to Kansas City. And she said the poverty, the misery, the wan-faced women and the hunger-pinched children, men trampling the streets by day and begging for a place in the police stations. The sordid, grinding, pinching poverty of the workless workers and the frightful, stinging, piercing cold of that winter in Kansas City will always stay with me as a picture of inferno, such as Dante never painted, referring to the famous Dante's Inferno with the circles of hell, right? So, and Kate Richards O'Hare, very vividly describes how bad things were. So farmers all over the Midwest, all over the country, really. When I talk about the West, in this case too, I'm not talking about California and Oregon and the Pacific Coast. At this point, the West is kind of like what we today call the Midwest: Iowa, Illinois, Kansas, Nebraska. That's where about as far as a lot of people were living. So there are people in California and Oregon, but most of the population is not yet moved out, like it is today, where California's the biggest state. So there are a lot of farmers in the West and in the South who feel this way, who are being pinched because industrialization is more important. And they believe that this new economy doesn't really work well for them. So what do? They begin to take action collectively, just like workers in the North had, joining, in the North, they had like the Knights of Labor, which I briefly mentioned. They had strikes and other things like that. You start to see farmers do the same thing. The agrarian sector, agricultural interests start to do the same thing. So one farmer, a woman in Kansas named Mary Lease, stood up at a meeting when people were talking about all the problems they had, and she said, it's time to raise less corn and more hell. And so that's what farmers did. They began to organize collectively. They got together because, like workers, if you deal with the bosses or the bankers or the people who own the land one-on-one, you have no power. But if you join together, all the workers get together, all the farmers get together collectively, then you have, a better chance, right? You can go up against the bosses and you can, do things in a hopefully a more effective way as far as they're concerned. So this is what they do. So one of the first groups that farmers formed was called the Grange. And the Grange has actually had a huge impact through this day. Farmers would get together and they would have kind of very similar complaints, right? I can't make a go of it. The prices are too low. So they began to form cooperative groups, co-ops. I don't know if you've ever heard of a co-op or a cooperative. People get together and they pool their interests together. They pool their money together or whatever they produce together, and they become a collective. They do it collectively in unity. It's like a union, right? You do it unified rather than one-on-one. So if I'm a farmer growing, corn or wheat or whatever, and somebody comes through, a buyer, I would negotiate with him, one-on-one, and more or less have to take whatever price that person offered because he could go to the next farm over and get whatever I have, right? So if we organize collectively, however, into a co-op, and they would organize things like buyers co-ops or both buyers and producers co-ops. So as producers, if everybody who grows corn gets together and they pool it together, then when the buyer comes through, he can't pit, make farmers compete against each other. So there's a price for corn, you have more negotiating strength, you can get a better price. And in the same way with purchasers co-ops, if you need farm equipment, maybe, you need plows or you need shovels or seed or whatever, if you buy it in bulk, it's like going to Sam's Club or Costco. It's the same principle, right? If you buy it in bulk, you can get a better price. So if I need plows and shovels and things like that, rakes and hoes, I would go to if you go into a hardware store, general store, and purchase them one-on-one, it would be at a certain price. But if all of us got it together and bought 100 of them at the same time, we obviously get a much better price, right? That's just basic, simple stuff, easy to understand, right? So farmers began to take collective action. They also began to form things like their own banks and their own insurance companies. And like the impact of the Grange, like I said, is still around. If you've ever seen Mutual of Omaha Insurance, that was created by farmers. There's a farmers insurance company. There's like a planters banks, things like that. Those were generally created in this period because farmers didn't believe that they could get a fair shake from these institutions that already existed. So they decided to create their own, right? So this is like the first, and this is like in the 1870s or 80s. You had a lot of farmers. They claimed, perhaps 1 million people who were involved in these Grange movements all over the South and the West. But the economy was horrible. And so, you can get together all you want, but if there's a depression, there's really not much you can do. There are these massive problems with prices. There are markets. I mean, we're seeing that in 2020. A study came out yesterday. People are spending way less on food this past couple months than they had been, right? So if you don't have money, then you can't buy stuff. Very simple, right? Idea. So the Grange, made an impact, but wasn't totally successful. There were other movements. There was a movement called the National Farmers Alliance, which also had a National Colored Farmers Alliance, it was called. There were a lot of blacks, remember, who became like sharecroppers and small farmers after the Civil War. And these small farmers are, always on the edge. They're very vulnerable. They live in a very precarious economic situation because they don't have, huge capital reserves. They can't go to banks and get loans and things like that. So there was also the Farmers Alliance and the National Colored Farmers Alliance with about, I think, millions of farmers total. I believe there were maybe about 3 million, 2.5, 3 million in the Farmers Alliance, and maybe about 1 million in the National Colored Farmers Alliance, it was called. And they were trying to engage in collective action too, but it was very, very hard to do. Now, by 1890, the situation is very dire. And so this is when you start to see the biggest movement, not just the biggest agricultural movement, but arguably the biggest protest, the biggest alternative political movement really in US history. And that was the Populists. And I'm going to spend a little time on this because it's a term that's coming around again. It's used all the time. And the way populism is kind of described and understood today is quite different than the way it occurred historically in the 1890s. And I think, that's worth knowing. There's a new book on it. I'll put a link up here later by a guy named Thomas Frank. If any of you are really into this, it's called The People Know N-O. And he talks about populism, and it's good. He's very sharp. And so I wanted to spend a little time on this because populism is different in the 1890s, way different than it is today. Today, populism is used to describe people who tend to be on the right, like Donald Trump or European leaders, Boris Johnson or Putin or Italians, Matteo Salvini and Bolsonaro in Brazil, often referred to as populists, and they tend to be right-wing authoritarian leaders, right? It's not the way farmers envisioned populism in the 1890s. Populism was always a class-based movement of people who were poor, part of the underclass, people who lived in precarious situations, people who were vulnerable in the agricultural communities, right? So, for instance, L.L. Polk, a very famous populist from Kansas, was talking about the way society was divided. Right? He thought that the biggest division in society, and this is a common theme with populism, wasn't between, race or ethnicity or gender or anything like that. It was based on wealth. And Polk said in 1890, he said, "You will see arrayed on one side the great magnates of the country, the Wall Street brokers and plutocratic power." That's who's on one side: Wall Street, plutocrat, big business, rich guys. And on the other side, you will see the people. Very simple. So you have these folks who own the bank, in fact, who own the farms, who own the land, who control power and wealth, and on the other side, it's everybody else. So, like I said, in modern times, this would be like saying it's the 1% versus the 99%. It's basically the same language. So, because of that, you now have this movement emerging. In 1892, a bunch of farmers got together and went beyond creating just like things like co-ops or banks or insurance companies, and decided to form a political party. And in 1892, they formed the People's Party, it was called. And the People's Party would later become the Populists, and that would become the basis of populism, right? Populism is kind of the ideology, the ideas behind this agricultural protest, and populists were the political party which just existed briefly in that period. So in 1892, farmers formed the People's Party, ran in local elections in the South and in the West, and actually did fairly well. There were populists elected to, local offices, community offices, sheriffs, things like that. And so they were a class-based movement. One populist newspaper said that populists had to fight against the wealthy and powerful classes who want the control of government so they can plunder the people. So it's a class-based movement, like the Northern industrial labor struggles were. It's a class-based movement like the Knights of Labor, the people at Haymarket or Homestead or Pullman or whatever, all right? So the People's Party attracted former Knights of Labor members, people from the Knights of Labor, which had kind of really fallen on hard times because the depressions of the 1880s and 90s really kind of destroyed working class politics. So a lot of people who had been in the Knights of Labor became populists. It was an easy jump to make. In 1892, the People's Party platform again brought out this class distinction. It said the fruits of the toil of millions of people work, but their fruits, what they produce, is boldly stolen to build up colossal fortunes. All right. So again, this producer's idea, we're creating all of this stuff. We're making this stuff, in this particular case, food, agricultural products, livestock, things like that, and we're not getting, anything from it. The people who own the banks, who own the land, who don't actually work, are getting the wealth that we create. So they had a specific political ideology, and it was based on taking care of working people, farmers, especially, against these wealthy interests. So today, populism today doesn't do that. Populism today is really based on an alliance with wealth, right? But that's not what it was in the 1890s. So in the 1890s, the People's Party, and then it became the Populists after that, had a specific political ideology. Now, it was based on this class relationship, right? So you had on the one hand this mass of workers, in this particular case, farmers. And on the other side, you had this group of people who were causing them problems: banks, railroads, monopolies and trusts. All right. So this is clearly a class-based movement. All right. Why these particular industries? All right. Banks are really important. Banks have massive influence over society because they determine who gets money and who doesn't. Right. And so unless you're independent, and most smaller farmers don't own their own land. They're leasing it, or they have a note on it, like you have a house, note to pay. And it's really hard. We're seeing that right now, right? I mean, right now in America, they're like a third of Americans in the last several months can't pay their rent or their house note. So, this is the case that the farmers see themselves in as well. They don't have the money, so they can't pay their rent. They can't pay the mortgage on their land. So they're losing their land, right? And they blame the banks for this because banks determine who gets money and who doesn't. Banks heavily favor urban industrial investors over farmers, which makes sense. If you go to a bank and you want money to build a railroad or a steel mill, an iron works, a canal, ships, whatever, that's the banks and the banking executives are going to be way more likely to help you out, to loan you money, than if you're a farmer who needs it to pay off his lien or pay off his mortgage or to even purchase more crops or anything like that. Industry is a much better bet for bankers, much safer than it is, to give money to farmers. So bankers are really important in this sense, offering better loans as well, better rates. So, even if you do get a loan as a farmer, you're probably going to pay more interest on it than you would as a, somebody who was creating a factory, right? So one of the problems then is that maybe the biggest problem is the banks. They hated bankers. It's funny. They're like, this is really big in popular culture. And when we get to the Depression, I'm going to talk about this again. Bankers have never been well liked in American society, especially in tough economic times, because bankers get, have all this power and they kind of have, money, they have capital, and they can determine who gets it and who doesn't, who wins, who loses, sometimes who survives and who doesn't, right? So banks are like probably public enemy number one. Railroads are really important to farmers because that's how you transport crops. So if you want to sell stuff in a market outside of where you live, you need railroads. And railroads charged higher rates to ship agriculture than industrial goods, which again makes sense, right? It's people like Carnegie and Rockefeller, in fact, had exclusive arrangements with railroads to sell oil, to sell steel and things like that. So they had first crack at the railroads, and they obviously got better rates because they offered much better business. They were always, agriculture seasonal, they're not producing as much, whereas you're always making steel and you're making, you're always refining oil and things like that. So there's a constant market going. So the railroads gave industrial investors much better rates than they did the farmers, right? They also didn't like monopolists and trust. Monopolies and trust, they are different, but in both cases, what they are, they're kind of legal arrangements where one particular industry or just a couple industries control an entire business, right? An entire sector of the economy. The best known, and again, make sure you read the book, would be like Rockefeller and oil. Rockefeller controlled pretty much all of the oil industry. He controlled the fields, the oil fields, the refineries, the railroads, and even the outlets where oil was sold. You don't have really gas stations, but oil for lamps and things like that. So Rockefeller controlled all of it. So that's a monopoly. When one particular business controls the entire industry, if a few businesses do, a very small number do, that's referred to as an oligopoly. But in this particular case, we're talking about Rockefeller and the monopolies. And a trust is similar. What a trust is it's a legal arrangement where a bunch of, where again, one particular industry, one particular business, like Rockefeller, again, can buy up a bunch of smaller businesses and put them in a trust. So they're separated legally into this trust, but the trustee looking over it has control over it. So for instance, at one point in the early 1900s, Rockefeller controlled over 200 other companies through the Rockefeller Trust, right? Or no, I think it was Carnegie, excuse me, Carnegie did. Again, it's in the book. So if you have that kind of control over the market, then you can really damage people who are small, who don't have that level of influence and power. And farmers, obviously are like that. Farmers need petroleum. They need farm equipment, which is often made out of steel. And people like Rockefeller and Carnegie especially were able to control the market and control prices and control output. So the farmers were at the mercy of the market forces created by northern industry, by bankers, by railroads, by monopolies and trusts, right? So that's part of their agenda. So they ran on this class-based idea, right? So it's not like populism in the 21st century, right? The word is used to describe people who are kind of angry and appeal to people, to working class people, but it's very different, right? The ideology is very, very different than what we're calling populism today, which is why I'm talking about it a bit. So these farmers get together and they put together a platform, and I'm not going to go over it here, but it's worth looking at. I'm going to talk about a couple elements of this, but you should take a look at it. And again, very different than what we consider populism today. So they had this platform. Now there are three things I want to talk about. One, farmers were concerned because they weren't making money. There wasn't enough money to go around. So you had a situation called deflation, right? And I'm going to talk about that again later too. Deflation, inflation is when prices go up, when the cost of money goes up. Deflation is when it goes down. Now, you're thinking, well, why is that a bad thing? Well, if you're selling stuff, it means you're getting less for it. And again, I'm going to show you some figures later, some statistics later. So farmers believe that the American economy, the currency, should be inflated. How do you do that? You add more money to it, right? So they believed that, right now farmers were growing more crops than people could buy. So prices are going down. It's very simple, right? Because of technology, you could produce way more stuff. And because of the various economic crises and the panics and things like that, people were buying less. So there's way more out there. You have a lot of stuff that you can't get rid of. Now, ironically, what's the solution? If you're producing too much stuff and you're not getting a good price for it, you actually produce more in order to try to sell more of it, right? So prices keep going down. And again, I'll show you data on that just in a little bit. So what farmers wanted to do was to create a larger currency output with silver. They wanted to make silver legal currency, all right? There had been a lot of places where they had bad prospectors who just found large amounts of silver. So farmers wanted to put more money into circulation, right? So that the prices of goods would go up and they could make more money that way. Now, maybe it would be easier to understand this if you think of what's happening in 2020, right? The Federal Reserve, and we'll talk about that later too. The Federal Reserve makes money. They create money. They essentially click a mouse and create, in some cases, trillions of dollars, right? Sometimes this is referred to as quantitative easing. If you're into econ, or if you ever come across that phrase, quantitative easing is the creation of money. And after the pandemic hit and businesses shut down in March and April, the Fed came in, the government came in and created trillions of dollars. This is kind of what the farmers wanted with silver. They inflated the economy. Right now, in this particular case, inflation stayed low, which is an entirely different thing. But the point is, you can create money. Money is just invented, right? So in this particular case, all you have to say in the 1890s, as far as the populace are concerned, is silver is now legal currency, right? So you can use silver, and so you're going to put silver into circulation, and there's a lot more silver, and so prices will go up because you have more access to money. The idea behind creating currency, the Fed does it too, is to make more money available for loans. So if the Fed creates $1 trillion, that goes to banks who are in the Federal Reserve System, who can then loan that money to other banks, who can then loan that money to consumers who need loans. So it makes money available. That's the idea behind it, to create availability of funds. That's why you give money away. Essentially, that's why you invent money. Money is just a kind of a concept, right? It's you just create it. so you can make anything money if you want, right? So in this particular case, they wanted to make silver money. And so they advocated free silver. That was a big deal with them. They also wanted a national takeover of railroads. They believed in the public ownership of railroads. Now, this is a big deal too. Railroads are private. American industry is private. American companies are all privately held, except for like the post office, right? And they're trying to get rid of that, right? So if you have, and railroads are particularly problematic for farmers, like I said, because the rates they charge and all that kind of stuff. So populists want the government, the public, the people to take over the railroads. Now, this is a direct confrontation with capitalism. In capitalism, the means of production and capital is privately held, right? So if you say we want the government to take over railroads and operate them on behalf of the people, that's not capitalism. So in this particular instance, the populists are an anti-capitalist party, a stridently anti-capitalist party. They believe that if you took over the railroads, then you could set prices that would be fair and equitable for farmers and not give so much priority to industrial, investors and industrial output rather than agricultural. So they wanted public ownership, nationalization. If you ever heard that phrase, nationalization, means the government, the people take over a particular industry and run it on behalf of everybody else. We're going to talk about nationalization a lot because the U.S. is always hostile to that idea. If another country tries to nationalize something, the U.S. generally is opposed to it and often kind of goes into those countries and does something about it. So they want to inflate the entire American economy by making silver a legal currency, the populists do. They want the government to take over to nationalize the railroads. They also want the government to create a bank, a new bank. And again, in capitalism, banks are owned privately, right? Banks are owned by people. It may not seem that way because you don't have the, individuals who come out like you would with Jeff Bezos or Warren Buffett or, Bill Gates or anybody like that, but banks are owned privately. So the populists wanted the government to create an agricultural bank, a bank for farmers that would loan money to farmers at reasonable rates, unlike the Wall Street controlled banks, and would allow them to use their crops as collateral, right? Because if you're ever going for a loan, you have to show how much money you make and, how much money you have saved up and things like that in order to be considered worthy of a loan, right? So if you really need a loan and you don't have any money, then you're less likely to get one. That's why you go to, payday lenders and title max and places like that, which are really, incredibly, inflationary and often predatory, right? So they want the government to create a bank for farmers. And again, this is not capitalism, this is anti-capitalist. So these populists were probably, I don't think there's any question, the most serious challenge to capitalism. Certainly in the period after the Civil War, but maybe really in all of U.S. history after the Civil War, they wanted to actually take away the private means of ownership of banks and railroads and create public institutions, which is not capitalist. The capitalists don't like it. They're opposed to it, right? So these are often, a lot of people said these are socialist ideas. There were socialists who sponsored and supported the populists, all right? Now, the most famous populist in America was a guy named William Jennings Bryan, who had been a congressman from Omaha. He was fairly young at the time, and he became the populist candidate for president in 1896. And he described the 1896 election as an election between the masses and the classes. So it's clearly a class-based idea. The classes meaning the wealthy, Wall Street, the Rockefeller, Carnegie, the bankers, and so on, versus the masses, which would be the people, right? So this is the populist idea. Now, another element of this is that there's also a racial element to this as well. The populists were integrated. So it included both black and white farmers, black and white workers too, but black and white farmers, right? And in fact, in local elections, prior to the 1896 election, there were Black populists who were elected to office. And I think one of the counties in Texas, I think the one up near, maybe near College Station, Bryan, is in Grimes County, maybe. I don't remember specifically. The sheriff and assistant sheriff were populists who won the election. And I think the sheriff was white and the assistant sheriff was African-American. And this wasn't unusual, right? So you have not only this alliance of working farmers who are challenging the power of the banks and the railroads and things like that, but an integrated movement which believes that, one famous populist, a guy named Tom Watson, who later became a vicious racist, said, something along the lines of, we're all living in the same ditch. They're in the same ditch as us. So they understood that the biggest difference, the biggest distinction in American life wasn't Black versus white, whatever, man versus woman, city versus country, rural. It was wealth versus workers, wealthy versus the wealthy classes versus the working classes, right? The masses versus the classes, as Brian said, right? And so they're demanding this public action. Now, the idea that the state would take over the railroads or create banks in opposition to Wall Street and Rockefeller and Carnegie was unthinkable to capitalists. That's not capitalism. So this is what populism really is in the 1890s, right? No populist today is, and certainly not the people who we call populists globally, Boris Johnson, Putin, Trump, Bolsonaro, Salvini, a bunch of others. None of them are in any way calling for public ownership of banks or railroads or anything like that. No, nowhere near, right? So the opposition party at the time it's the Republican Party. The Republican Party, remember, emerged with Lincoln. It was the party opposed to slavery. It dominated politics and this is something that comes up quite a bit too. I'll spend a minute talking about it. The political system in the late 19th century is very different than it is today. So saying the Republicans did something or the Democrats did something in the 1890s really doesn't mean much, because what's happening today is pretty much 180 degrees reverse from it. The Republican Party after the Civil War was the party of business. It was the party of Wall Street, the party of industry and production and bankers and things like that. The Democrats were party that was stronger in the West and in the South among working people. And it was a party of racial segregation. The Democrats had always been powerful in the South. So after the Civil War, Democrats were not open to, creating 40 acres and a mule, creating the Freedmen's Bureau, toward giving African Americans equal opportunities or anything like that, right? But when people say, well, the Democrats, yeah, they did in the 1890s, it's very different today. So again, history is very illuminating and useful, but sometimes you can use it to confuse things as well, right? The 1890s, the Democrats were a very racist party. They did not want African Americans, associated with them. They were hostile to Black political interests. Now, the populists, however, weren't. So the populists were an amalgamation, I think is the term they used. Fusion, well, that's a different term, never worked on that. The populists have both Black and white farmers in it. And this is important because it's a class-based movement. So if you are a producer, if you are not wealthy, if you are making stuff, whether it be in industry or agriculture, then you stand in opposition to the wealthy Wall Street producer classes, right? So William Jennings Bryan represents these interests, and the populists are ready to run this election in 1896 based on this class-based idea, the classes versus the masses, right? However, there's a twist in this. And history often has twists and turns, like detective stories or something like that. The Democratic Party, the populists at the time were a third party. The Democratic Party is having a convention in 1896 too. And now the populists and Democrats are kind of going after the same people: farmers, poor people, Southerners, people in the West, people in the South. So the Democrats were having a convention in 1896, and they're having trouble coming up with a candidate to run. If you've ever seen conventions, not the kind of stuff you just saw on Zoom and things like that. In the old days, you'd have conventions where people would go and they'd vote on who the candidate would be. Well, the Democrats keep voting and voting, and no one is getting enough votes to become the candidate. And William Jennings Bryan was at that convention, and he gave one of the most amazing, important speeches in U.S. history. He went to the Democratic convention, even though he's a populist, and he gave a speech, often referred to as the Cross of Gold speech. And, it's linked up there. Bryan lived well into the 1920s, so even though this is in 1896, he would later go around the country reciting it. People would pay to go in and listen to him recite the Cross of Gold speech. So there are recordings of it, which I have one linked over there, as well as the transcript too. So Bryan stood before the Democratic convention and talked about how important farmers were to American society, how farmers were the most important people in America, right? And he said, and he stands up there and he kind of evokes this Jesus-like image, specifically, on purpose. He does it specifically and on purpose. He said, if they dare, and he's talking about the Wall Street people and the producers who want the gold standard, they want the silver to go into currency because the gold standard, there's not enough gold. So there's not enough money in circulation, and prices, are very dear, not cheap. So they want to put silver in circulation because there's not enough gold, and they want to inflate the currency. So so Bryan says, if they, Wall Street, Northerners, the Republicans, bankers, industrialists, people like that, if they dare to come out in the open field and defend the gold standard as a good thing, we shall fight them to the uttermost, having behind us the producing masses of the nation and of the world, having behind us the commercial interest and the laboring interest and all the toiling masses. We shall answer their demands for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold, right? The imagery is very obvious. A crown of thorns, crucifying somebody on a cross of gold. Bryan kind of sticks his arms out, when he does this, and the crowd goes crazy. He evokes this imagery of the crucifixion in order to talk about how important farmers are. He says, look, if you quit making stuff in factories, things would be tough, but people would get by. But if we quit growing crops, if we quit making food, there would be weeds growing through all the cities in America. People would be starving. It would be this like apocalyptic Mad Max kind of version of life if farmers weren't taken care of, right? So Bryan, because of that, was so wildly popular that he got the Democratic nomination. So the Populists and the Democrats decided to create what's called a fusion, joining together, right? In order to have both, kind of instead of competing against each other. But there was one part of the deal that the Populists had to make, which in the long term was a disaster, right? Because the Democrats' position on race, the Populists had to sell out the black farmers. So Populists could no longer be advocates for racial integration. So they took the Democratic position on that. And William Jennings Bryan became the candidate in 1896 on this fusion ticket, the fusion of the Populists and the Democrats, right? And they would run for office based on this platform. Now, the platform in many ways is very progressive. Some people call it socialist. I mean, in addition to the silver and the railroad nationalization and creating a bank, the Populists advocated free public education. One of the first groups to do that. Much of the public education in America was created by Populists. Populist governors were were in states which were the first places to give women the vote. There wasn't a federal amendment on women voting until 100 years ago, 1920. But in some states where the Populists were in charge, women got the vote, in the late 1800s. So they had very progressive agenda in a lot of ways, even a socialist agenda in some ways, but not on this racial issue. So William Jennings Bryan is the candidate in 1896, and he's running against the president who is from Niles, Ohio, which is where I'm from, and the incumbent William McKinley. And at the time, people from Ohio were powerful in Republican politics. They were dominant, right? And McKinley was the candidate who was favored by banking and industry. They liked McKinley and they didn't like the Populists, right? So again, it's very different than populism in 2020. I mean, bankers and industrialists don't hate populists. They, they benefit from them. But in 1896, they didn't like the populists. They, in fact, were terrified. So in that election, William McKinley in 1896 had anywhere between 10 and $15 million for his campaign, a huge amount of money. William Jennings Bryan had 300,000. So you have 10 to 15 million versus $300,000. In today's money, that would be, if one candidate, that would be like one candidate having between 300 and 500 million. So it could be as much as $500 million, and the other candidate having 9.3 million, right? So you can tell which class interests see their state, how class interests see their interests, right? What stakes are involved in this. So industrialists, bankers who are afraid, who hate the populists, they don't want free coinage of silver, they believe in a conservative gold standard, they don't want to inflate the currency with fake money as they see it, who clearly aren't going to nationalize the railroads, that's socialism as far as they're concerned, who aren't going to create a bank just for farmers, put huge amounts of money into the McKinley campaign. McKinley won. Now, the populists did well in southern states and in western states. They had populists elected to, state legislatures and in some places governors and things like that. But the Republicans won the day. So populists got millions of votes, but McKinley and the Republicans won the election. The populists, kind of met failure as well, kind of like the industrial workers. When you're going up this intense power of capital, it's really hard to take them on. So the populists, they created this movement, got millions of people involved in it, just like Northerners did. Ultimately, however, it didn't work. They were not able to defeat this vast power, right? So there's a lot of stuff in here on this. But one thing in addition to that I want to mention, because this is probably like at the end of the semester, sometimes the only thing people remember. Even though you don't know it, you're probably aware of populism in 1896, because one of the people who was at that convention when William Jennings Bryan made his speech was L. Frank Baum. And L. Frank Baum, if you know, wrote The Wizard of Oz, which is, I'm sure you've all seen it, as kids, right? And many, many, many years later, some history people were looking through this, and they kind of made a connection between the characters in The Wizard of Oz and the populist convention. And so they put together this kind of long theory of it, where Oz stands for OZ, ounces, which is how you measure the price of gold and silver. Follow the yellow brick road, which is like gold. The Tin Man was the industrial worker. The Scarecrow was the farmer. The Wizard of Oz was William Jennings Bryan, right? So there's all of these things in it. So anyway, take a look at that. You'll get a kick out of it. All right. So all of this stuff is going on in the period after the Civil War. So you have unrest in the cities, you have uprisings and labor actions and things like that in the cities, and you have this populist movement in the farms. Now, they did present a challenge to the American ruling class, to the bankers, to the industrialists, but ultimately they were defeated. In the populist case, it was probably the most important challenge to the biggest alternative to American capitalism, really in American political history, right? I mean, they did get millions of votes. They were considered a threat to the the political system, which is why bankers and industrialists, gave McKinley, hundreds of millions of dollars, and Bryan, the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars today, and Bryan, had peanuts compared to that. $300,000, even in 1896, that's not a lot of money for a political campaign, especially when the other guy has, maybe $15 million compared to here, 300,000, right? So that's 50 times more. So it's a huge gap. All right, so by 1896, then it's very clear that this capitalist system is entrenched, it's in place, and it's not going anywhere. You can have challenges to it, and there are problems, and a lot of people aren't happy with it, right? It's firmly in place, but like I said, there are a lot of people who aren't happy, and there's still a lot of problems with it. The 1890s, which is when populism occurs, which is when Homestead and Pullman take place, which is where strikes all over the country are occurring, is a time of great crisis. So even though capitalists are in control, right? They run the country, and this is clearly a capitalist system, a system based on these businesses, these banks, and these industrialists, people like Carnegie and Rockefeller. There's still a lot of people who are unhappy, and there are a lot of problems that are still, in place in American society. And so this is a period where we often refer to as the crisis of the 1890s, the crisis of the 90s, right? Now, perhaps the biggest problem is something that maybe wouldn't seem like a problem at first, is that because of industrialization after the Civil War, because of machines, because of the creation of factories, new technology, cotton gins and tractors and stuff made out of steel rather than iron, production in all areas blew up. It was significantly bigger. And I gave you those numbers a couple of days ago, which are just up here a bit. And there's a good example, right? Coal, steel, industrial machinery. So there's this massive increase in production all over, and including in agriculture too, right? So what you have then is a situation where there's overproduction, right? So you're producing more than you need, right? You generally produce, it's kind of supply and demand, right? Production and consumption. Supply and production are the same thing in demand and consumption. You produce things for people to consume, to buy, right? So your responsibility is to consume stuff. You're a consumer, right? So these factories and these farms and everybody else is producing more stuff than can be consumed. It is supplying more stuff than is demanded. So you have overproduction. Now, what's the problem there? If you produce way more, and this is where, like if we're having a class, it's a lot easier because you're discussing and talking to people, and you can talk it out. So if you produce more stuff than people need, what happens, right? If I'm producing iPhones and I have a market of 100 people and I produce 100 iPhones, then I can set the price. However, if there are 100 people who need iPhones and there are 300 iPhones available, what happens? The price goes down. That's overproduction. So prices are lower. Deflation, which is what the populists were talking about, right? Now, why is that a bad thing? Wouldn't you rather pay less? Well, deflation means your wages are going down too. And it means businesses are going under, which means jobs are being lost. So because of this problem of production and overproduction, you have to find a solution. What are you going to do, right? Do you quit making stuff? Capitalism is like a shark. It's got to keep moving and growing and growing and growing. If it doesn't keep expanding, then you have situations like 2020, right? We're seeing elements of that now. So you have to find new places to sell the stuff you make, and you have to find new people, new markets to buy the stuff that you make, right? Now, in the United States, you're kind of maxed out. You've produced what you can, and the demand is already there. People, workers in the North and farmers in the West and South don't have a lot of money, so it's not like you can go buy a bunch of stuff. And now you're starting to see, it's not quite yet at the point where it'll be in the 20th century, but you're starting to see an increase in consumer goods. And in the book, there's a long section about that, and it talks about a lot of the things that are being developed in the 1890s and early 1900s. You're starting to produce things like canned fruit and vegetables, stuff that people can buy, but most people don't have enough money to buy it. So you need to find new markets, new places where you can sell stuff, new places where you can purchase goods, where you can get raw materials, where you can get cheap labor, where you can invest, right? Now, along with this problem of production and overproduction is something here that I'm going to talk about because it's very important in various periods, right? In the 1890s, you have a problem of surplus capital. It's not the most exciting thing in the world, I know that, right? What does that mean? What is surplus capital? People who own factories and banks make money off of them. That's how capitalism works. You make profit, and then what do? You reinvest it, and you produce more stuff. Or if you're a bank, you want to loan more money out. Well, if you're overproducing goods, then you're starting to lose your ability to reinvest and kind of create more money, to make that money make more money, to keep multiplying, and so on, right? You make something, you sell it, you get money back, you make more of it, you improve it, you make more of it, you sell it, right? You create new goods and new prices, like, why you have like a new iPhone come out every 6 months, so you can, sell more stuff, right? Well, for investors, the problem is with capital. If you have capital, you're supposed to invest it. You don't just hide it, underneath your mattress, or dig a hole in the backyard and hide it in a lockbox or something like that. You're supposed to reinvest it. Well, if you're producing more than the market can absorb, if you're supplying more than the demand, if you're making more stuff than can be consumed, then all of that capital you have is just sitting there. You're not using it. You're not loaning it out at interest, which is how you make profit, right? So it's a surplus. Now, this is a big problem. You have excess capital and you have excess production, right? So bankers and investors and people on the financial side, the fiscal side, people with money, people on the monetary side, people with money want to be able to loan that money out and to invest it. And people on the production side want to be able to produce more goods and sell them, right? So they're both facing the same problem. So what's the solution to that? Well, it's finding new markets, and where are those new markets going to be? Ultimately, they're going to be abroad. And so in this period of great economic crisis and great social crisis in the United States, strikes, populism, all kinds of stuff like that, there was a big movement in the early 1890s, 1894, of unemployed people called Coxy's Army. An unemployed worker named Jacob Coxy led 10,000 people to Washington, D.C. to protest against unemployment. And they were attacked by the crowds. That's something else too. If you see the news, that's not new, right? So the state would come out and attack protesters, right? So there's a lot of social unrest in the 1890s too. There are people in the streets, there are protests, the militias are coming out, the police are coming out, the guard is coming out. So there's a lot of actually violent conflict going on in the 1890s. That's not new. So you have to find a solution to that. And the solution becomes finding markets, especially overseas. And this is important because this leads to the emergence of American imperialists. This is when you start to see the United States create what a lot of people will call an empire. Now, what's an empire? It's generally a big country which owns other places in the world, right? So Britain, remember, had an empire in North America. That's what 1776 was all about. The British had an empire all over the world. Britain controlled all kinds of places, owned India and Egypt. The French Empire controlled Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. The Germans had an empire in many places, including the Congo. Belgium had an empire in the Congo and Africa. The Germans had possessions of colonies. Colonies generally are owned by empires in Africa. The United States never really did that, and people to this day still deny the U.S. did. But the United States knew that it had to go abroad and gain control. Now, it did it differently, and we're going to talk about that in a minute too. But it understands that it has to find new markets. So because there's too much capital, you have surplus capital, you have too much production, you have too many goods. And again, read the book, because I explain this stuff in better detail, and it's slower, right? When you read, things kind of slow down, right? So you have the emergence then of American imperialists. Now, that didn't just begin in the 1890s. The United States had been getting interested and more heavily involved in places outside of the US for a long time. And it started in the early 19th century, often with missionaries, right? You know what missionaries are. There are people who go to other places in order to save those people's souls, right? So in the United States, you have all these Christian missionaries. Later you'll have Mormon missionaries and things like that. And what they do is they go to other countries to save people, to try to convert them to Christianity, right? So they go abroad. Well, in many places, once they got to these foreign countries, they realized that there was business to be done there. Many of these places were not developed. They weren't, industrial capitalist societies. They were kind of what today we call the third world, or the less developed world, or the developing world, or something like that. So a lot of missionaries who went there to save souls ended up starting businesses too, right? So in many of these places, missionaries were not well liked, right? So a good example of that is Hawaii. Now, the first Americans got to Hawaii in the early 1800s, and they went there to convert Hawaiians who were, many of them were kind of from other Asian places. They were Polynesian, native. And so these Americans, these, kind of white Christian missionaries showed up in Hawaii to bring Jesus to these folks, right? When they got there, they saw that there was a great amount of money to be made. And so they started to invest, especially in the sugar industry and the fruit industry too, but especially in sugar. So by the middle of the 19th century, Americans controlled much of the Hawaiian sugar industry. So even though Hawaii was a kingdom at the time, it's an independent kingdom, but increasingly Americans have control over the economic and political system of Hawaii. Now, it wasn't a formal empire, but the Americans had control of it. Hawaiian sugar was sold to the US and virtually nowhere else. American investors in Hawaii controlled the political system. And they got cheap labor from the Hawaiians. So, I mean, Hawaiians often compared it to slavery. In fact, after the Civil War, a bunch of these planters in Hawaii actually tried to get American blacks from the South to move to Hawaii to work on the plantations there, right? So you have these missionaries who go there who become businessmen. And by the 1880s, the Hawaiians are not, they're never really happy with it because they have, this is their wealth, right? These sugar plantations are native to Hawaii, and these Americans have come in and kind of dominated their economy, dominated their politics. And so it's becoming a big problem. And in the early 1890s, a new emperor comes to power, Queen Liliuokalani, right? Queen Liliuokalani is a nationalist, probably a term you've heard before. Nationalist is somebody who wants, in this case, her country to be independent. They don't want other countries dominating them, right? So she began to demand that these Americans, change the relationship, the economic relationship, that Hawaiians have control over their economic system and their political system, right? The Americans don't like this, so what do? In 1893, a group of Marines went to the palace where Queen Liliuokalani lived, and they overthrew her. They had a coup. Luckily, it was bloodless because the Hawaiians knew they could not fight against the Marines, right? Now, who became the leader in Hawaii after that? Who was put in charge? This is where it gets good. A guy named Sanford Dole. Think about that for a second. I'll take a sip of coffee while you contemplate why that name Dole is important. All right, I'm sure you figured it out, right? Dole pineapple, Dole fruit. So they put the guy who headed the biggest, company in Hawaii, the American, in charge of the entire island, right? Now, there was talk of annexing Hawaii, making it part of the United States. But that didn't happen because for several reasons, but one of the reasons was that the United States also had business to do in Cuba. Now, there's a lot to be said about Cuba. It's been an American obsession for a long time, by 1893, 1895, 1898, right? The Americans always wanted to own Cuba. Why? Because it's a big country, and geographically it's pretty big, and they have a developed agricultural industry there, especially things like sugar. Big sugar industry, sugar plantations all over the place. And the Southerners before 1860 thought, well, we can have slavery there too. So the Americans, especially Southerners, had been agitating to take control of Cuba for a long time. In the 1840s, Southerners created private armies to go in and try to take over places like Cuba and Nicaragua. They were called filibusters, if you ever heard that term. In 1854, the Americans went to a place in Belgium named Ostend, where they met with foreign officials from Spain, because Spain controlled Cuba. Cuba was a Spanish colony. And in 1854, these Americans told Spain, you have to sell it to us. And if you don't sell us Cuba, we have the right to take it over. What do they say? By both divine and the rights of man and the rights of God or something. They invoked this divine right that God wanted them to take over Cuba, right? So the Americans had always had this fantasy about taking over Cuba. Now, inside Cuba, there's a lot of social discontent. The Cubans, like the Hawaiians, are not happy because the Spanish in Cuba, like the Dole people in Hawaii, are virtually enslaving these people. They're taking all this wealth out of Cuba, and they control the Cuban political system. So a movement for Cuban nationalism developed, kind of like Queen Liliuokalani, and there's places all over doing that. Now in Cuba, this movement was led by a guy named Jose Marti, who's still a hero. If you ever go to Cuba, you'll see statues of Martí all over and stuff named after Martí all over the place. So the Americans, ironically, supported Jose Martí, not because, I mean, they said that they didn't want anybody to be controlled by another country, and they were anti-colonial and all that. And I mean, they're not lying. America's anti-colonial in the sense they don't believe in these former colonies. So Americans supported Jose Martí, and they kept insisting that Spain sell Cuba to the United States. Now, by the 1890s, situation in Cuba is pretty bad. The Spanish are becoming far more violent and repressive. The Spanish commander, a guy named Valeriano Weyler, nicknamed the Butcher, it's like a mob hitman, right? The Butcher, Valeriano the Butcher Weyler, was essentially creating like concentration camps, kind of like strategic Hamlets in the Vietnam War, putting these Cubans in them. So it's a really bad situation. So this movement against Spain inside Cuba is getting bigger and bigger. The American support of these Cuban rebels, these revolutionaries, which is ironic, is getting bigger and bigger. The Americans are raising money for Martí and for the rebellion in Cuba. And the Americans are going to Spain and insisting that Spain sell Cuba to the United States, and the Spanish basically say, this is our colony, you know, get out. You have no business telling us what to do. And so this is coming to a head at the same time that Hawaii is kind of blowing up too. So the United States has these crises in Hawaii and in Cuba that it has to deal with. And this is occurring at the same time that there's this economic crisis in the United States because of production and overproduction and surplus capital and all this other stuff. Now, at the same time, you have a bunch of people in the United States who are saying, okay, here's the solution to all our problems. We need to take these places over, right? We need to take over places like Cuba and Hawaii. And there are a lot of people who are doing that, right? Now, the book covers all these names in some detail. I'm not really going to go over it, right? But this is kind of a list of the people. Like today, these would be the folks who would be on TV talk shows on Sunday morning, or being featured on Fox and MSNBC and things like that. These are the folks who are kind of like the theorists of American imperialism. And they had a lot of different ideas. There were a lot of reasons for it. Josiah Strong was a minister who believed in missionary work and Christianity. So you had to go abroad to bring Christianity to these poor people because they were heathens and they weren't going to go to heaven because they weren't Christians. People like Brooks Adams, who was the grandson, I think, of John Quincy Adams, believed in something called social Darwinism. I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase. It's the idea that certain races and religions of people are superior. And so they were fit, right? Survival of the fittest. So they were fit, so they should go in and take over other places, right? So that's part of it. Some people think, well, the United States, we're superior, we're Christian, we're white, we should go in and take over these places, especially these places like Cuba and Hawaii, where they're not white and they're not Christian, or, well, they're Catholic in Cuba, which, is for Christians, is not really much better, right? For a lot of Christians at this time. One of the most important theorists was a guy named Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was an admiral, wrote a famous book called The Influence of Sea Power on History. Now, what's striking is Mahan advocated a huge navy. He believed the United States should build a really big navy. Why? What do you use a navy for? To fight off foreign countries, to try to take you over or try to invade you? No. Mahan pointed out that throughout history, the importance of a navy was to defend commerce. The reason navies exist is to protect American ships who are selling and buying stuff. That's why navies exist, for commerce. A couple of years ago, how they have these commercials on for the armed forces especially during like college football games and things like that. And there was an ad on for the Navy, which specifically said, we protect, I forget what percent of the world's commerce. So Mahan said, you need a big Navy to protect American ships who are selling and buying stuff, right? And then maybe the most important of these people was a man named Charles Conant. Conant was a banker. And he was an advisor to people like Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller, and he knew Woodrow Wilson and a bunch of these other folks. Conant was mostly concerned with this idea of surplus capital, that Wall Street and other bankers had too much money. They weren't able to invest it. There weren't places to invest it. The money was just sitting there. It wasn't being used to make more money. So Conant said, we need to find new markets. And Conant said specifically that these markets should be in Asia. And this is going to be increasingly important in this period and all the way through 2020. Right? Asian markets are still really critical. That's why the United States and China have started to really butt heads far more aggressively, you know, tariffs and all that kind of stuff that they did before. So all of these people collectively create this idea that, you know, most Americans finally buy into it. Yeah, we need to go abroad. We need to find new places. We need, you know, to take over Hawaii, and we need to do something about Cuba. All right. Let me finish it there for today, and we'll pick this up next time. This is the third lecture. Watch these as they come out. You know, I'm trying to put them out every few days at least. Keep on top of things, keep the reading going. You know, some people have emailed me with concerns about, you know, reading and when we're going to have an exam and stuff like that. We'll set an exam date soon, but it's not immediate. It's, you know, we're in what, late August now, so it won't be for a while. You know, if you haven't gotten the books yet or there's a problem, contact the non-beginning publishers if you're having problems with access. You know, read the syllabus just like me and Snoop said. And, you know, good luck, you know, take care of yourselves. Like I always say, wash your hands and wear a mask and be safe and all that kind of stuff. And we'll see you next time. So bon voyage for now.